Welcome, and thank you for joining me today for a segment we call One-on-One with Leaders. Today I'm joined by Kathryn Miller, Publishing Services Librarian with NIST Information Services Office, to discuss guidance for NIST staff on using inclusive language in documentary standards, a recent publication by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, of which Kathryn was a lead author. Kathryn, very nice to meet you, and thank you for joining me today. Tell me a bit about yourself and your work at NIST.
Yeah, nice to meet you too, Karen. Thank you so much for inviting me. So at NIST, I'm the Publishing Services Librarian. I work in the NIST Research Library, and there I manage the production, dissemination, the bibliographic control, and impact assessment activities related to the NIST Technical Series publications. So these publications include the SP 800s and other cybersecurity guidelines, which you've probably heard of. Many people use them in industry and they have a wide-ranging impact, but also include publications going back to the beginning of NIST in the early 1900s. So we have about 19,000 that we're custodians of right now.
Yeah, that is a lot of standards and certainly a really critical job. As
Yeah.
highlighted in my introduction, NIST recently concluded a project on inclusive writing, and so a really great project related to NIST publications. Can you provide background on the project and how it came about?
Sure. So it actually started in June 2020. We received some emails from the public about some biased and exclusionary language in our technical publications. So for example, words like master and slave and blacklist and whitelist are frequently used in our technical documents, more frequently in the cybersecurity documents that I referenced earlier. So the employees responsible for authoring those documents worked on how they were going to address those specific comments and how they were going to, if they were going to update those documents or make a decision about that. I decided that it would be a good opportunity for the library to provide guidance to all of our authors for the NIST technical series publications on how to use inclusive language in their work. So I started with researching what other organizations were doing. I reviewed various style guides in both humanities and science and technology to see what language was out there already. And I got a lot of input from my NIST colleagues. And so at first I released this guidance on inclusive language internally as an update just to our author instructions. And then around that same time, my colleagues, Lisa Carnahan and David Alderman, asked me to join the standards inclusivity effort, which was a team put together by NIST leadership, tasked with writing guidelines for all of NIST staff on using inclusive language when participating in standards development activities. So this was sort of a wider reaching guidelines than the ones I had written just for the publications that I manage.
Great. Yeah, no, an awesome opportunity and so great for them to invite you to participate in that. And gender inclusion, inclusive language, equity, diversity, these are all very important topics being discussed, not only on the international plane, but here in the United States among standards bodies, the Women in Standards and other groups like the UN. How does NIST work in this area fit into that larger landscape? And what is that unique role that you see NIST playing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So NIST is definitely not the first to address these topics. With regards to inclusive language specifically, for example, in the guidance that we wrote with this team that I mentioned, we point to organizations such as Google and Microsoft who have already removed biased language from their systems. And since NIST publications and researchers have such a wide reach and impact on industry, government, academia, in various fields of science and technology, we felt it was important to contribute to this effort. The guidelines that our team published will hopefully help NIST staff advocate for consistent use of inclusive language in documentary standards being developed by standards organizations and in documents supporting physical standards. So if we give them the tools to advocate, hopefully this advocacy will result in widespread either creation or adoption of already established inclusive language policies and guidelines. So it's definitely, like I said, we're hopefully not the first nor the last, but we really wanted to contribute because of our role within science and technology.
Mm-hmm. So great. And Kathryn, NIST guidance for NIST staff, you've noted that the guidance was written for NIST and it's on using inclusive language in documentary standards, published back in April. Can you tell us more about the paper? And as an example, what are the overarching issues or themes that you feel will parallel with other groups?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the standards inclusivity effort team was tasked with publishing guidelines for NIST staff on using inclusive language in standards development activities. From when we convened in July 2020 to right before the guidelines are published, we had a lot of conversations about inclusivity. So we did a lot of research on inclusive language concepts, which, you know, is the idea of inclusive language is a little bit different from the whole idea of, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion. So we had to scope our project. We learned of similar activities within NIST and externally. We got a lot of feedback from our NIST colleagues on many iterations and drafts of our guidelines. I think at some point we had over 200 comments that we had to go through just from internal NIST staff. And ultimately, after all of that, we decided to base our guidance on 3 sources. So the first is the author instructions that I mentioned earlier that I developed for our NIST Technical Series publications. The second is the American Psychological Association Style Guide. And the third is the Chicago Manual of Style. So these sources provide what most people want when it comes to inclusive language, which is examples of words or expressions to avoid. I think that's the #1 question that we get when we're talking about inclusive language. Okay, what am I not supposed to say or write anymore? But instead of us creating a definitive list of don't use these words instead, we felt that the synthesis of these multiple sources and other resources and what other organizations are doing will hopefully give NIST staff the tools to make their own decisions on how inclusive language fits into their professional fields, just because we have such a wide reaching impact in so many different fields at NIST.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, a lot of comments received. I think you mentioned over 200. That's quite a bit. Certainly important topics to be covered. Which recommendation in the paper do you feel took the longest or perhaps the most robust discussion to reach consensus on? Or perhaps from an alternate perspective, which were the easiest to identify?
Sure, I'll start with the easiest. So the easiest was in our guidance was the benefits of inclusive language. So the benefits of inclusive language are well documented in published literature and also anecdotally. Thinking about how language impacts others will create a welcoming space for everyone. So, but that leads us into the most difficult part is the act of changing your language to create a welcoming space is difficult. So the conversation broadly about the focus on what words am I not allowed to say anymore was the most difficult part. So a lot of the comments that we got were about specific words. In the 3 sources that I mentioned all have their own lists of words to avoid and words to use instead. So a lot of the comments were reacting to those. So that was difficult. I mean, obviously, if you're going to write guidelines about inclusive language, you have to actually include some language to help guide people. And we needed to be specific. So we knew we were going to get a lot of comments. So our team actually had to become amateur linguists as we debated alternatives for words that had been identified as harmful. But as you may know, words in science and technology documentation sometimes have different connotations than in the general vernacular. So I think a breakthrough moment was when we realized that our recommendations didn't need to be finite, because language is always evolving and changing, with what's going on in society, and different people's experiences and perspectives based on the groups that you're working with. So we wanted to make sure that our guidance stated that we're only publishing now what reflects current understanding. So it may be updated in the future, and we wanted people to understand that, and to really think about the context, and that it can grow in the future and change in the future.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think we've mentioned it that this document was developed for NIST staff and their use in inclusive language, but it's been suggested that the paper would be equally useful for others in the standardization community. Was this something that NIST discussed? And if yes, which groups may have been identified as potentially benefiting from incorporating the recommendations into their work?
Yes, that's definitely the case. Our team discussed many times that this would probably be a very useful resource for other standards development organizations. Obviously, if an organization has their own specific guideline and guidance on inclusive language, then our NIST staff are responsible for knowing and following that guideline or policy. But if a particular organization doesn't have a policy, we are hoping NIST staff will use what we wrote to advocate for inclusive language. To your question about if any organization is currently using this, IETF, an organization, has advised their participants to use our guidance in all contributions going forward. So we were really excited about that. And so in lieu of writing their own guidance, they've decided to adopt ours, which is, like I said, really exciting, and something I know the rest of my colleagues and authors on this paper would encourage other organizations to do, if they don't have their own, and don't have the resources to develop their own.
Yeah, no, and such an amazing win. And maybe there's other organizations that are considering this now. So for those groups, how can they gain a copy of the document? And is there additional education or perhaps a reference library that they can use if they'd like to continue their research into this work area?
Yeah, definitely. So this guidance, like we said, is written for NIST staff, but it is freely available to anyone online. Um, I can put a link in the write-up of my answers to these questions, but if you just Google NIST IR 8366 or NIST Inclusivity Guidance, it should show up in the results at the top. And in the document, there is an extensive bibliography that has a lot of resources if you want to continue researching and working on improving your language in your documents and being more inclusive. But I've really found that the best resource is starting conversations with your colleagues. I think that's what I learned the most. I can do all the research I want, but when you're talking with people that are using this language frequently, or that this language has previously used language has harmed them, and getting their perspective on what good alternatives would be, that was the most useful research that I did.
Hmm. Yeah, and if other organizations want to pursue a similar initiative, what guidance can you offer? Were there any lessons learned through this experience that you'd highlight?
Yeah. So, like I said, the most helpful guidance I can offer is to listen. So, in this instance, when we were writing these guidelines, there really was no such thing as too many cooks in the kitchen, which is a terrible phrase and is very old and not inclusive at all for people who've never heard it before. So, yes, it's very hard to talk inclusively and make sure, everybody understands what you're saying. But it was a good thing that we got so many comments, and put this document through so many rounds of review, because we had so many different perspectives and comments that we would have never thought of. And I know from personal experience, before I was a librarian, I was a copy editor. Opening up comments on anything to a wide range of people, and especially on documents that are related to DEI, is daunting. But in this case, it really was absolutely necessary. I do recognize that we feel ownership over the language that we use, it's woven into our personalities and our experiences. So debate over language, spoken language, written language, can feel really personal. Um, but from my perspective, I am a white female, and I'm going to approach my work with my own inherent biases. And even if that bias is a simple lack of lived experience due to my background, but we can't have a conversation about language without considering as many perspectives and experiences as possible. So it was really important to me that we made sure that we were talking to as many people and as many groups at NIST as we could when writing this guidance document.
Yeah, no, and our thanks for you saying that, because certainly for us, all voices and all views are important. So wonderful to hear you kind of echoing that. And looking to the future, does NIST have additional projects on this topic that they hope to work on?
Yes, so specifically with regards to inclusive language in standards activities, we're going to continue to review the conversations about this topic and may update recommendations as needed. I've already received some comments from the public that we're reviewing right now on my author instructions specifically, because I do have a list of words in there to avoid and possible alternatives. So it's a living document and conversation for sure. In the DEI field, there are many projects going on in NIST. We have a steering group for equity in career advancement, which is really important, and is focusing on equity in STEM careers. And recently, studies sponsored by the steering group were published as NIST Technical Series publications, including some reports by Mary Theophanos and Justina Zwalak, who I think you spoke to recently as well, or at least published something on the website.
Oh yeah, no, and our thanks to them. They did offer an article on their work, and so we got a really good insider look into the different topics that they're researching. So yeah, a great thanks for those listening. Feel free to visit the website to see their article. And opening that up, if others would like to work with NIST, like you're working on the comments that you received on this issue and to engage further, what recommendations do you have as to how they can connect with you or with NIST?
Yes, so I would really like to continue researching and having conversations about inclusive language in scientific and technical research outputs. If you want to talk to our standards coordination office about how to implement inclusive language guidelines in a standards organization, you can contact them directly. If you want to discuss words or phrases that should be phased out of scholarly research, or suggest better alternatives to those terms we have already identified, you can definitely contact me directly. Like I said, I've already received a few email comments about our examples of terms to avoid. Having conversations with my team, I've actually already taken one out of the examples because it just wasn't a good enough alternative, let's say. So we're definitely listening and making changes based on the comments from the public and also from within NIST, but open to anybody.
Excellent. So good to hear. And maybe as a final question for this interview, and just any takeaways or aha moments that you'd like to share with our viewers.
Yeah, I think a big aha moment was the first round of comments that we got back from our NIST staff on something that we had spent months, researching and writing in our own little group, and things that we would have never even thought about, situations around inclusive language that we didn't include in our guidelines that we should have included, but we just didn't think about it. So like I said, the idea of having your inherent biases, even if that bias is just, missing out on all these experiences and issues because of my background, that was a big aha moment for me when I realized, oh, this work really needs to be achieved through having conversations and talking to more people and opening it up and creating a welcoming environment ourselves that people feel comfortable providing comments and suggestions. So, yeah.
Yeah, and to carry that forward, thank you for those watching today for joining us for this discussion and this segment on one-on-one with leaders. And our thanks to you, Kathryn, for joining us from NIST to talk about this recent publication. I think we've all learned some great details and some insights into how we can carry this discussion forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm always willing to talk about this.